Well, here we are. So, welcome everybody to a Mutation Salon sort of special event. This is, we've done book clubs before, but this feels a little bit different, just in terms of the spontaneity of it and the interest and intrigue in delving into Bergsonism by Gilles Deleuze, and by extension, of course, Henri Bergson as a philosopher. It's kind of, we get two different thinkers in one book, which is really great. And as I've been told from Bergsonians, Deleuze's Bergsonism, as a book itself, as a text itself, it does a pretty fair job introducing Bergson. I know that some Bergsonians have quibbles and quarrels with maybe other things Deleuze does, but this book in particular seems to kind of shine through those sorts of debates. So that's one of the reasons why I recommended it. And in terms of the format today, it's going to be just about an hour rather than an hour and 15, just because of my own time constraints. I have a toddler duty at the top of the next hour. So I'll be putting on my Papa hat and taking off the philosopher hat. So I want to just jump in with you all. Um, a few kind of points. This is more of a discussion, right? Like I haven't really put together a kind of lecture, but I'm hoping that some of us have either A, read the book before and are seeing this as an opportunity to kind of delve in together, share their 2 cents, and B, for those who haven't read the book, function as a kind of collective primer, right? How does one get in, introduce themselves to this particular text? What are the inroads and recommendations? What are the kind of key themes that we're looking at here? And just, going around and sharing that. And in that spirit too, if you are the kind of person who likes to have this sort of parallel chat in the text chat, I would love to just hear from you if you haven't joined Mutations before. Um, yeah, just a quick little intro. Are you in academia? Are you studying Bergson or Deleuze? Are you in a philosophy program? I myself am in the California Institute of Integral Studies philosophy program, PhD program. So Deleuze and Bergson come up quite often in the program. But as my little introduction, that also serves as sort of a framing for today in this book. Um, you know, if you're familiar with that program, maybe some of you aren't, there's a lot of cosmological questions, looking at the evolution of consciousness and paradigm shift and different worldviews. Folks like Whitehead and process philosophy are quite popular in the program, and for good reason, right? But as I've been hearing from folks and how I've shared this attitude myself, Bergson is sort of criminally underappreciated in sort of the process-oriented circles. He has a very different approach than Whitehead, right? And by extension, Deleuze. But I would love to see more of that present in philosophy, particularly in what we're talking about today. So, my intrigue has been, bringing or making connections between the philosophy of Bergson and Deleuze and the work of thinkers like Jean Gebser, who wrote about structures of consciousness, but really like, adapted some of the key Bergsonian terms, such as spatialization or non-spatialized time. This is really where Gebser draws his terminology from. And then some of the sort of founding thinkers, influences for folks who look at the evolution of consciousness, let's say like Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, were radically influenced by Bergson. Bergson was a sort of a formative inspiration for them, de Chardin in particular. So he's there in the program, right? He's there in the kind of present cultural context, but he's also not really at the surface. He's sort of latent or sort of behind these other thinkers. So I'm hoping, riding along with this sort of Bergsonian revival that seems to be happening in academia, that this discussion and other discussions like it can participate in that, bringing Bergson a bit more forward and making connections with other thinkers, and particularly this theme of an evolutionary metaphysics, right, or an approach to philosophy and philosophies of time. They're adequate, as Bergson talks about it, to a world of becoming, right, a mobile reality. So that's just my little intro. Segment, but I'd love to kind of open it up if we're feeling into that, and if not, I can weave in a few more comments. But I'm just curious, as a show of hands, has anyone read Bergsonism before, or Bergson before, or Deleuze for that matter? Oh yeah, yeah, a little bit. Yeah, great. Yeah, I'm seeing a couple strong yeses and then a little bit. Good, good, good. Yeah. Well, as my friend J.F. Martel talks about, Bergsonism is a great introduction to both Bergson and Deleuze because you get kind of, um, you get to understand if you're interested in Deleuze, this is sort of like a key reading, right? Where you really get all of Deleuze's whole project kind of flows from his approach in Bergsonism, right? You see that he's kind of going at the same sort of philosophical problems in his own project, and the methodology that's in the kind of opening chapters. I have some notes here, but I don't have too much. Again, this is not a lecture. Um, some of the key concepts and intuition as a philosophical method in chapter one, what he lays out there. Then, of course, for folks who are interested more in the concept of the virtual and memory in Bergson, there's chapter three. And then if there's time, I'd love to. The one that I can talk the most about myself is probably chapter five, on the Elan Vital and the kind of evolutionary metaphysics that's being painted there, and how strongly resonant it is with thinkers like Teilhard de Chardin. And then also some pushback too, right? Some wrestling with the framings there, really interesting. But yeah, maybe kind of going into it. Does anyone who's read this book or read Bergson and Deleuze before want to, jump in with a few comments, or reflections, or perhaps even suggested framing as we explore this together? Ah, Tom, I appreciate that. Yeah, JF's framing of Bergson. This is a course that JF Martel from the Weirdo Sphere and Weird Studies. He did a Bergson class a few years ago, or a year and a half ago or so, and a more recent one-off seminar on mutations, about Bergson's last book, The Two Sources of Morality and Religion, and that was a really great deep dive. But I'm hearing you say that JF's framing was more accessible than
Yeah,
the Bergson I read. Yeah,
I got the
yeah,
book. I read that last chapter and I didn't see anything of what I heard from JF's summary in that. So it was pretty obtuse for me to try to read the Bergson, even that
gotcha.
last chapter.
Mm,
So okay, now I'll be quiet and just
mhm.
listen.
Yeah, no problem, no problem. No, that book. I mean, there's resonance here with Bergsonism and two sources for sure. Just um, as somebody in this evolution of consciousness or cultural evolution framing and program, right? Perhaps I would say intellectual lineage. That book and the last chapter of that book, as it sort of traces an evolution of morality, right? And religion and its relationship with modernity and technology is really interesting, right? Um, but also this book is looking at sort of the deeper metaphysics, right? Or what is a kind of evolutionary metaphysics, not just of the human, but of life itself, right? As he gets into, as Deleuze gets into here. Um, so yeah, any other opening notes, comments, questions, framings? Hmm. And I recognize it's quite a heady subject, so kudos to anybody who's jumping in at the outset here. Hmm. Well, okay. For me, maybe this will help. Not keen to push my particular take. Okay, well, no problem, Daniel. Maybe as we kind of go into this and delve in a little further, because I am interested in everyone's takes. Maybe as we continue to share. Um, yeah, so I think for me, some of the most important elements here, right? Of course, is in chapter one. If you're looking for, Deleuze is uh, uncharacteristically succinct and clear in this book. I know there's something to say about his approach to writing philosophy, that kind of needs the sort of stylistic and aesthetic approach he has. But I've just found, Deleuze's sort of solo books to be more accessible, the ones about particular thinkers and philosophers. But this one in particular, Bergsonism, the way in which he sort of lays out the intuition as method and gives us the principles and offers us the framings is just really accessible. And I think it's probably you can read through it without too much of a guiding hand, if that makes sense. Um, let's just see here. Ronnie's saying, I have briefly read about Bergsonism, but curious enough to find Deleuze. Seem to have made criticism against Bergson. I'm curious about that too. I've only briefly read Deleuze's late cinema books, right? Cinema 2 in particular. Um, I found that one though. I didn't really recognize any overt criticisms. Um, but I found in that book, that's a good companion actually to this if we were going to continue to read a sort of explicitly Bergsonian Deleuze, the Cinema and Cinema 2 books are a really good follow-up because, you know, and I found this too with The Fold, Deleuze's book, The Fold, that when it's applied to a particular work of art, when it's applied to sort of a way in which we're engaging in the world in a material sense, the concepts really come to life. So sort of the cinematic medium as the way in which he's expressing these concepts, the way in which he's sort of showing more in a sort of Gebserian fashion, if you're familiar with Gebser and the evolution of consciousness, Gebser's kind of applying this framing of, as Bergson says, space, time is not space, right? This is sort of famous quip, how he sums up his philosophy to someone who sort of challenges him to do so in after a lecture, and he says, Madam, I would sum it up as paraphrasing, time is not space. And the sort of challenge of modernity, as I understand Bergson framing it, right, is that we spatialize time, right, where we should be transforming our way of thinking to be more adequate to a mobile reality, right? There's really a radically different kind of starting premise for Bergson with his metaphysics. And Deleuze just does a wonderfully elegant job kind of laying it out and moving us through those concepts. Um, so there's that, right? And of course, with the first chapter, the methodology is sort of laid out very clearly. Um, that just in terms of the first rule, right? Applying the test of true and false problems themselves, right? The true and the false is a notion here. But then also, I'm just jumping a little bit since we don't have too much time to delve into everything in detail, right? But the one that's really stuck out the most for me has been, I can get to it here. The third rule on page 31, when he's talking about state problems and solve them in terms of time rather than of space. And I feel like that really just opens everything up because as he frames it, right, with Zeno's paradox, Zeno made this error, right, where movement or time itself is an indivisible reality, right? The mobile reality is indivisible, but the tracing of this mobile reality, the kind of after image of it, well, that's divisible, right? And we can infinitely divide it. And so what, moderns have been doing, and really what we've been doing since the ancient Greeks, has been spatializing time, right? And has caused this sort of tension or problem. And this is sort of the resonance with Gebser, right? And that Gebser sees this as a kind of tension in cultural evolution, right? We have a sort of spatial consciousness that's attempting to know the world more exclusively in that way, when really that sort of temporal reality, the sort of undivided mobile reality, is pressing into our awareness from all sides and becomes a kind of time crisis in Gebser's work. I know I'm kind of doing an adjacent comment here about Gebser, but this is Mutations after all. We do talk about that. So that's very interesting. And again, I want to open it up. I see some more folks are coming in here. I see JF. Good to see you here. Uh, I welcome you if you want to jump in and make any comments, since it's more of a
I sorry
hopefully a roundtable.
I'm late, but I'm digging it.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, cool. I mean, yeah. So that one has really stuck with me. And to me, this is sort of my little soapbox when it comes to models of cultural evolution or the evolution of consciousness. Is that I think starting from this premise, state problems in terms of time rather than of space, automatically kind of resets the table here, right? because with a lot of the models, right, we have these sort of developmental schemas, right, where there's particular stages and they sort of advance in a particularly linear way, right? Time is assumed to be divisible, right? And becoming is assumed to be spatial, at least to some degree, in a degree that we can exhaust explanation. And Bergson and Deleuze, by extension, are saying we can't do that, right? We have to start from different foundational modes of thinking, and of course, this comes about as the method of duration, right? Or yeah, of durée, right? And intuition as a kind of method. I wouldn't say like folks like Gebser are explicitly making this connection, and Gebser himself is not saying what I'm doing is a form of intuition. But he really, implicitly he kind of is in that sense, right? Because he's saying, time is undividable and we need concepts that are adequate to um, the world as unfixed and in movement, right? And undivided. So what does that look like? How do we do philosophy that way? And then how do these philosophical problems sort of cascade and echo out into a civilizational problem, right? And how we're engaging with a living and dynamic and relational world. Maybe my other comment, because I'm kind of just jumping around with different probes here and feelers, is the and JF, you talk about this quite a bit too, the weirdness of Bergsonian time and his resonance with the climate crisis or the quote unquote meta crisis, right? Because Bergson's time is, the past is present, it's coexistent with the present, and so is the future as virtual, right? And Deleuze gets into this, of course, too, in the book and introduces it, and I think he does a good job in it. So this sort of the coexistence or simultaneity of past and future as having a virtual, agentic uh, coexistence with the present, in the present, right? That the present is both past and future, right? It's a multiplicity and has these different qualities and different dimensions. Um, in a kind of writ large sort of way, and I talk about this in my new book, the climate crisis has sort of become has transformed our present into a Bergsonian present, right? And I mean this just in the sense of the industrial fires, the intensity and the heat of the past, which we're always feeling, the momentum of industrialization, and then the entanglement with these sort of apocalyptic futures, right? That the different thinkers like Schrecker Horvath have talked about this, that the apocalypse is in some virtual sense already happened and it's influencing our entire sense of time and subjectivity, right? We have a different relationship with the future now as moderns. We no longer see it as something that continues to advance. So it's working on us. It has an agentic force. And so our present is very weird, right? The future is here, our present is future, and our present is past. And the both are kind of coexisting and in some sense sort of overcoding or overlaying and certainly ladening us with a sense of those temporalities. So time has become strange and very weird and entangled, and past and future have become present. So for me, anyway, this is sort of my 3 minute pitch for why reading Bergson and by extension Bergsonism with Deleuze is so vital right now because Bergson's offering a kind of temporality that describes the present, exactly as JF saying, time is out of joint, right? There's so much to say about that line, but okay. So those are my kind of opening points here, right? The importance of the framing that Bergson is offering with spatialization and time is not space. His methodology, intuition as method, right? And then the appropriateness or the necessity of really beginning to read our present moment in crisis as a Bergsonian time, a time out of joint, as JF was just pointing out. And if those of you are, if there's enough of us here that are interested in evolution of consciousness material, et cetera, I feel like that's a whole rabbit hole we can have a lot of fun going down and delving into. And that's sort of my like 3.5, right? That's my point 3.5 is like that kind of stuff, right? What would a non-spatialized approach or model or approach to an evolutionary metaphysics really look like? Going back before Teilhard and going to Bergson, right? What happens if we start there? So that's one of the prompts. But I'm curious to see where we want to go or what's coming up for us as we're opening things up here.
Jeremy, could you read those three provocations again? The first three.
Yeah, let's see. So the distinction between, time is not space, right? We spatialize time when we really should not. That observation, I think, is just so revelatory. Um, the second one, of course, is the alternative philosophy as as intuition, right? And intuition as a methodology for not doing that anymore, right? How do we not spatialize time? How do we engage with time on its own terms? So intuition. And the third one is the relevancy of Bergsonian time, which we understand as the presence of both the past and the future, right? They're coexistent, or rather, like the present is both past and future in Bergson's temporality, similar to Gebser, right?
Mhm.
That is something that is profoundly and radically descriptive of our weird moment of apocalyptic meta crisis, climate crisis, time crisis, right? So I think time becomes this sort of dominant theme, of course, across all of these 3 points. And then for the nerds, the bonus one is just how would we create, or what would a evolution of consciousness model or schema or narrative look like if we really embrace this sort of Bergsonism, right? This sort of Bergsonian approach to it, rather than kind of jumping forward with the kind of directive stadial models as a lot of these approaches tend to do. Um, okay, I hope that all made sense, but those are my little key themes here anyway.
May
Yeah,
I
yeah,
continue?
Jeff, please, please do.
Just the question. I love what you're saying. How does this model, sorry, let's turn off the fan here. How does this model of time in your mind differ from a block universe idea of time where the past and future are present insofar as they're determined, right? As so far as they're fixed. Is this how you interpret it? Or do
Yeah.
you see, as I think I do, a difference of kind between the past and the future? Um,
Mm,
yeah, the future being
Mm.
open and the past being fixed.
mm.
Do you
Great
understand what I'm saying?
question.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. And
Because you
I
could
know
get into a
we've.
block universe idea, right? Like
Mhm,
Eric Wargo,
mhm,
and then you still have the co-presence, but there's nothing we can do
right.
because our actions are predetermined.
Mm.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess, like you, I fundamentally feel that this is just my gut sense that time doesn't work in that way, right? That, uh, in Gebser's framing and my reading of Bergson and again, by extension, Deleuze, there's a malleability to time. And I guess maybe we kind of emphasize one past or future. Future feels very open. But in Gebser's thinking, right, time is open. It doesn't mean that there's distinctions to be made. So I kind of go back and forth, right? Well, maybe the past is actually a lot more malleable and less fixed, right? There's a kind of chironic nature to time in that it's creative and it remembers itself differently. That memory has a kind of fluidity to it, an entanglement with the future too, right? So maybe past and future are unfixed, right? Maybe past has a bit more density and a bit more of that memory and groove, but there still is this sort of very interesting way in which the past transforms depending on sort of what kind of future we call in, right? Like the meaning and the context of the past transforms. That there's an adjacent thing that Tolkien talks about with eucatastrophe. I've really loved because there's a framing. I forget which author talked about this, but he says eucatastrophe isn't just sort of like everything was okay in the end. It's more like things happened and interceded, right? There's sort of a divine sense of providence, but it doesn't forget the past. It just remembers it differently, right? The wounding is still there, the brokenness is still there, but um, you know, the world remembers that brokenness in a way that allows for the future to remain open, right? For the possible to be um, more present, right? I would see, my reading of Bergson is that both past and future are unfixed, right? Time is unfixed. Maybe there's a little bit more density and heaviness with the past for good reasons, right? As he talks about. But the sense of the virtual past and virtual future means there's sort of an unfixity and dynamism and entanglement in both, right? That it's not as linear. It gets messier. It gets a little brackish for me.
Mhm.
I don't know what you think about that, JF, and other folks too in your
Well,
room.
I totally agree that the reframing of the past is not fixed, but I do think that you can't reframe something that's not there, right? So the way that eucatastrophe re-envisions the past, reinterprets the past, that is dependent upon future and present. But I would think that the past needs to be there needs to be a kind of well, there's a moment in Deleuze's book on Bergson where he gets into the question of being, ontology, and Deleuze says being is the past, precisely because the past is no longer um is set. It happened. But that doesn't mean that it's fixed in the sense that it's reducible to some it's constantly changing in light of how things develop. So I totally agree with you, but I still think that there's like to me there is a there, I think there needs to be a difference in kind because the future is what hasn't happened and the past is what happened, and the difference between what hasn't happened yet, so it's a virtual, it's an open possible, and what has happened to me feels like it's like time becomes asymmetric in that sense. But I think that essentially I'm saying the same thing you're saying.
Yeah, yeah, I appreciate the difference in kind that you're emphasizing. And of course, Deleuze emphasizes that throughout Bergsonism, right? Making those kinds of distinctions without spatially dividing these characteristics. Yeah, I mean, again, I go back and forth, but I do feel, I think generally speaking, that the sense that the virtual future is more open, a bit more unfixed, right? Maybe time as a whole is this dynamic thing, but the differences in kind between past and future, they do have the characteristics you're describing, right? There is a kind of, I mean, Bergson does have his memory cone, right? And which is
Yeah.
talked about in this book. And so there is an unfolding happening. And I find this to be such an interesting question, right? Because this is always where questions around chronos time or directed time kind of pop in. And I think some folks are ready to kind of jump in at this moment and see, well, here's linearity. Time isn't as weird as Bergson's saying because he's still relying on that kind of unfolding. But I think Bergson's more doing something more than that, as you're pointing out too, right? It's
Yeah.
not that reductive or simple to describe.
No, but he does
Mhm.
believe in a kind of like uh irreversibility of the new, like that
Mhm.
which is revealed is then that which,
Mhm.
so
Yeah, and there's an interesting parallel too. I mean, this kind of gets to the three and a half theme. Like I have 3.5 points, right, on the Alain Vattel and evolutionary metaphysics, right, where that's sort of how he's tracing life, like the evolution of life kind of follows that, right? There's these lines of differentiation, and the past is something which happened, and there's constraints, right? We don't undo those constraints, but life finds a way to sort of work around them or layer them and go in different directions and then find these openings, as he says, and this is the element where I think Teilhard probably got a lot of influence from, right? Just and for folks who are curious, thinking of a particular chart towards the latter half of the book, if I can find the page here, was it 106, 107? Or maybe right before that. Yeah, here we go. Right, where he's talking about actualization, the Elan Vattel as movement of differentiation. That's chapter 5. Um, where he's talking about, it is as if life were merged into the very movement of differentiation in ramified series, right? So there's a need in Bergson's metaphysics to have a particular kind of unfoldment where things that happened are established as having happened and being part of the universe's unfoldment. And yet, that creates the conditions for the new to arise, right? Um, I think for me, another way to put the sort of weird, um, the nonlinear element of that is the way in which life or the elan vital um, remembers itself differently, right? Where it's like, yes, I always use this example in my classes, the cephalopod evolution. Cephalopods used to all have these big exterior shells, right? Fish evolved, and sort of this evolutionary competition with other organisms emerged in the oceans, and so cephalopods basically did this really interesting move where they interiorized their shells and they became the gladius bone in the center of their body. So it's sort of interesting where it's like I'm taking a thing that's very well established in my own body morphology and I'm remembering it differently. I'm using it in a different way. I'm not undoing the past, but I'm remembering it differently. I'm having it in a different context, a different relationship with the rest of my morphology, and that opens up new possibilities. Um, and that just feels to me very resonant of what I'm talking about with that. It's affirming the necessity of this sort of unfoldment, and yet it's very fluid and dynamic, and it folds and it bends and it rearranges the context of the past as the new continues to unfold. So it's like you kind of get a little bit of both, right? We need that history to unfold. We need that kind of consistency of memory, but that also becomes the template for life to kind of reinvent its own past in new ways, right? Um, anyways, yes, this is great. Any other? I see there's some comments, and let's just take a look here in the chat. Oh, that's a good one. I feel like I'm not equipped to go into it too much. I wonder how you see the distinction between the dominance of temporality over spatiality and process philosophy. I love Matt Segal's work, and I'm intrigued by Whitehead. I've read Isabel Stenger's. I've dabbled into Whitehead a little bit and process thinking. Is it still too linear? I really don't know. I can't give you an adequate Whiteheadian um, mm, I can't like adequately describe what Whitehead's doing, and the times that I have, Matt has often brought in more nuance and suggested that well he's actually more he's doing more interesting things than the critics are proposing and critiquing. For me, just my gut sense is that Bergson is really doing something a bit more weird, right, with time. There's a kind of a particular systematic approach that I sense in Whitehead. I could be totally wrong here, but the kind of concepts and the resistance to too much of a systematic approach in Bergson feels important to me. I don't know where that goes, but I feel like there's a key distinction or difference there that Bergson is really kind of leaning in a little bit more into this intuition as method and really working with time in a way, maybe it's harder to work with and maybe it's sort of incomplete in that sense, but I feel like there's something Bergson's doing that's still a little bit different than process thought. But of course, process thought is sort of sharing a similar kind of approach to reckoning with time that we see in the early 20th century and innovating in a particular direction. Whether or not it's adequate, maybe it's like for another or further discussion. I see Gunnar, would you like to jump in on that note?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, perfect.
Great, great. Yeah, this is wonderfully interesting. And one way I guess the main way I see Bergson is sort of like a kind of a mystic in a way, but he uses the vehicle of philosophy and philosophical discourse to sort of deliver his ultimately emancipatory message about reconnecting to the living dynamic reality in which we're constantly always immersed, yet we keep spatializing, because we've learned to divide up. He says that several times, right? That we are for the needs of our practical ordering of our daily affairs, the opposable thumb that we evolved to develop and so forth, we learn to divide reality up into spatialized chunks. And I think that's ultimately what gives us a sense of subject-object separation. So it has some kind of deep roots. It's not just in modernity, although it's maybe supercharged in modernity, but it goes way back. So I'm interested in, like, what is, if we really take the concept of qualitative multiplicity seriously, like if reality truly is this qualitative multiplicity that we're constantly sort of abstracting out from into spatialized chunks that we can sort of conceptualize and build technology and architecture and everything that we need to live. But Bergson is very clear that if you want to be a philosopher, that is to say, if you want to be a philosopher in the sort of original Pierre Hadot sense of like actually penetrating into not just theorizing, but actually experientially penetrating, then you have to adopt a different method. You have to coincide with the unfolding of reality as a qualitative multiplicity. And so maybe there's something there you could reflect on, Jeremy, if you want, what this might, how it might relate to, the integral mutation of consciousness that Gebser speaks about, how it might relate to, the obsession with, the vision in modernity, then how it sort of distantiates extremely the subject from the object. And also maybe more it's like pushing the mystical interpretation very far. How this notion of qualitative multiplicity, if reality really is a qualitative multiplicity, that is to say, it's not a Newtonian partes extra partes kind of thing. It's seemingly like that, but it might be infinitely more intimate, actually, what we're in. So the intimacy may actually be this kind of holographic, kind of fractal nature, which we find in the famous poem by Blake, but you also find it in Plotinus and some of the church fathers and stuff like that. So where actually you can see that reality is sort of perforated by wormholes all over the place, going from the past to the future, from the future to the past, and that not only is reality holographic sort of spatially, but it's also holographic temporally, if it makes sense to say that. So yeah, any comments on that?
No, I mean, yeah, very interesting thoughts. There's a lot to reflect on there, but yeah, I think you're so the first initial point, right, on the emancipatory nature of Bergson and this qualitative multiplicity, right? Um, what I maybe one way to sum it up for me is, with Bergson, he's asking the philosopher to engage with philosophy in the fullness of being human, right? The fullness of our senses, the fullness of our being. We bring our soul into it. We bring everything that we are, our consciousness, into that engagement, right? And we have access to something that's much more immediate in a sort of radical sense, right? And the intellect is sort of a servant of that, right? It makes distinctions, it makes quantitative differences. And there's even a way, on what's it, page 30, 34. I've always liked this too, because it allows for the empiricist, it allows for the kind of mentation or the mental structure, right, of the intellect. I think the mental structure in Gebser and the intellect in Bergson have a connection there. To be an aspect of this reality, right? But it's no longer the kind of exclusive arbiter, that judges what is real and what is not real, right? So we bring more of ourselves to philosophy, and therefore the poet and the artist, I think, are very, kindred spirits as we read Bergson. And the mystic, of course, as you're saying. But yeah, on page 34, Deleuze is describing, that, although it is illusion, space is not merely grounded in our nature, but in the nature of things. Matter is effectively the aspect by which things tend to present to each other. And to us, only differences in degree. I just found that to be really interesting comment, right? Like that mobile reality lends itself to a spatialized appearance to some degree, right? That it does yield to that kind of knowledge. But what if we approach philosophy not from that exclusive form of knowledge and spatialization, right? What other aspects is this reality expressing or capable of, right? Beyond that. So there's sort of a multi-dimensional affirmation, right? Where there's more of a trusting of our being in the world, right? I think maybe, I don't know if Bergson talks much about trust explicitly, but there is this sense of trust that I sense in his approach here, right? Like, yeah, we have access. It's not like Kant's, Cartesian subject object encapsulation, right? The correlationist circle, right? There's something that goes beyond that. And I always point out too that Kant even felt that way. It seemed like when he talks about his sort of infamous line about, the stars above me and the moral law within me. It sounds kind of weird and abstract, but there was a sense in which, like, the heart kind of goes beyond that limitation, right? There's sort of a morality of the heart that goes beyond um, that gap. But anyway, that's an aside. But I love your framing there. Bergson as mystic, but really Bergson, the wholeness of the human being, it can trust and entrust the world to disclose other aspects of itself, and that we have other capacities too. There's something quite, Bergson is not as systematic as the German romantics, but there's a spirit of that in there too, I think, with German romanticism, right? They're also talking about, oh gosh, what do they call it? Intuitive synthesis. I forget exactly how they framed it, like Schelling and Novalis, but they had a similar kind of sense of like, well, no, we participate in the world more readily than their contemporary philosophers were saying, right? They loved Kant, but they wanted to go beyond. Um, so yeah, a lot there, a lot in all of this, and there's many different directions, but thank you. Yeah, great comments. We got a little bit more time. Anyone else want to jump on the mic? If not, I'll circle back to our chat here. Some interesting comments in here. Let me check yeah. So Daniel is saying in physics. Daniel, you're also welcome to jump in on the mic if you want to share. And if not, I can read your question or comment. Okay, let's see. Yeah, well, Daniel was saying in physics, there's not much weird about time being whole and continuous. Bohm. The odd thing is that the world is broken into discrete parts by the assertion of spatiality. Delanda, do you mean Manuel Delanda, shows the history of spatiality and dominance and places it in early farming. What started as arbitrary dividing in kinds of terrain extended into a habit of dividing. I find that to be very interesting too. There's not in Bergsonism, but Deleuze has made some interesting observations too about kind of agricultural states. And I'll try to find the source for this. It's in my manuscript, but there's a connection he makes with, civilization itself is a gesture of abstraction, right? And there's sort of indigenous ways we can think about that. But folks like James C. Scott, the anthropologist, talk about this sort of dividing mind yielding itself to, well, counting the grain, right? Counting populations. Particular types of crops lend themselves more actually to that kind of quantitative and divisible thinking. And those have tended to be more successful in agricultural states in the rise of early states. So I think there's a connection there. And even in my own, again, this is more of an evolution of consciousness exploration, but still quite relevant. That, because of the conditions of agricultural states lending themselves to this sort of intellectual divisible thought, right? The mental consciousness really was sort of prone to arise out of those conditions. If we think of civilization as a kind of environment, right, in a more ecological sense, it begins to make sense why the mental structure really kind of becomes much more pronounced and much more exclusive as we move into ancient Sumer, and we start to get these themes of more patrilineal or patriarchal, of course, but also the themes of, William Irwin Thompson talks about this alienation and ancient Sumer and sort of existential wrestling with death and the gods and looking back on the old kind of mythic and magic animistic gods, right? With a bit of distrust and even disdain, right? So we have that kind of distancing that civilization affords, and this kind of mode of thinking is very much entangled in crops, states, measuring rods, and so forth, right? I think that's very much a part of the story. Yeah, and then let's see. Jose is saying, I'll be reminded of the concept of atonement. This view of time could allow us to better make sense of it. I'm curious to hear more what you mean. Love to hear more about that concept. I also wonder how this is related to his philosophy of religion. I feel like JF would be great to speak about that since we just had a great seminar on mutations about, again, Bergson's last book, Two Sources of Morality and Religion. But JF, I think you made a
Yeah.
really clear connection there. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I don't know. I'm trying to figure out how it connects to specifically to atonement, but
Mm.
certainly there is in Bergson an evolution of his philosophy. Um, there's a strange kind of reversal. Like if you read Time and Free Will, he really does seem to be writing as a kind of non-dualist where reality is this pure qualitative multiplicity, undifferentiated, except insofar as it's a multiplicity, like a single melody. But as he progresses through his career, he's putting more and more emphasis on the reality value of the spatialized world. So that by the end, in order for two sources of morality and religion to make sense, you need to recognize the spatialized world as fully real. Because you can't have moral decisions without differentiations between subjects and objects. So you suddenly need to have a stable spatialized world that is also transcendent of any spatialization, that is also more, just like the way you framed it earlier, where there's like yes but there's so much more, and if you don't consider the more, then you're living in an quote unquote illusion, because you live in a world that's only spatialized. Time is only thinkable in spatial terms, and therefore you're missing duration and the melody and the qualitative multiplicity. But when it comes to the final book, where he's developing a moral philosophy in which the mystic plays a central role as the creator of morality, that's what the mystic does. Then you suddenly have a kind of equivalence of of space and time, and that's like a lot of that comes through his encounter with Einstein and his recognition, even in creative evolution, where he has to reckon with what you were saying, how the constraints can't be reversed and the constraints have to be real in order for evolution to progress. And so he's more and more recognition that there's this kind of biphasal nature to reality where it's both space and time. And the problem is that the space part is inexplicable. Like, why does duration lend itself, as you were saying, to spatialized measurement? And that's where, in the final book, I think that, well, this discussion of space and time is not featured prominently in the final book. It's kind of implicit, but my take is that this is where his idea of the divine comes in. That there's a kind of creative force, creative intelligence behind nature that, through grace, gives us a universe that's thinkable, workable, that moves, that evolves, that creates. And and so that's where he ends up with, I think atonement in that sense could be a kind of reconciliation of oneself with this creative uh, this creative force that is not simply a kind of blind will to power as it seems to be in creative evolution, but actually has a kind of moral dimension and is trying to bring about, and that the human emerged as part of this drama that has to be on some level interpreted in terms of not just the true and the false, but the good, right? As like there's this movement towards atonement. And yeah,
Yeah, very well spoken, JF. As you're describing that too, there's a clear resonance, of course, with Teilhard's sort of theological bent in his reading of Bergson, but also Aurobindo, right? Right, this sense that, as Aurobindo describes, that the matter has this latent goodness in it, right? The universe is inherently good. There's a sense of divine providence, or how exactly to put it. Um, I'm thinking of Gebser because Gebser has a similar notion. He doesn't call it involution, but in Gebser he talks about how origin or Ursprung, the sort of creative principle, um, want not want is probably too strong of a word because he's not using that, but it is it coalesces with the human for various reasons. Maybe it's part of the unfolding of the cosmos, but there's an incarnational bent in that, right? That it becomes with us, right? It's inviting a becoming with, and a human being is a being, as Deleuze talks about here, in quite a mystical or Aurobidian sense towards the end of Bergsonism. I guess we are getting to that final point, right? Um, that the human is, or as he says, duration, life is in principle memory, in principle consciousness, in principle freedom. Life, he's saying life is the, in a virtual sense, this is what matter is. It's expressing itself, maybe not in a sort of Hegelian, self unfolding kind of process through a dialectic, but there is this sort of struggle to realize, as he says, how does he put it here? Yeah, on man's line of differentiation on page 107, the Elan Vital was able to use matter to create an instrument of freedom. And he's very clear about that point here, to make a machine which would triumph over mechanism, to use determinism of nature to pass through the meshes of the net, which this very determinism had spread. And he's quoting Bergson there. Freedom has precisely this physical sense, to detonate an explosive, to use it for more and more powerful movements, right? And then the above paragraph, he talks about, that we're a finite that's adequate for the infinite, or a part that's adequate for the whole in that sense, right? So there's this sort of
yeah,
interesting kind of mysterium conjunctionis, right, in the sense of the meeting of those quote unquote
yeah,
opposites in the human being, right? And quite a mystical statement. This could fit right alongside Aurobindo or Teilhard.
yeah.
Uh,
Or like Bergson's famous last, his last sentence in Two Sources, which is that the universe is a machine for making gods. And so
exactly.
our technologies then become, in a kind of token-esque way, a form of subcreation by which we rehearse that cosmic machinery. That in our machines, we are creating symbols of the cosmic machinery that is divine and is creating, this kind of echoes of Leibniz in there too, I think.
Yes, yes. I know I said we have to go at the top of the hour. I'm like kicking myself, but the conversation is just starting to get good. Um, but I would love to do, like, maybe we can schedule a kind of follow up to kind of get into these points, because this is sort of it's funny that this was the tertiary point that I was hoping we'd get to, but didn't necessarily need us to. And now it seems like, okay, this is really where we're gonna maybe drop in a little deeper, because there's so much more to say, just to kind of close with that paragraph above when he's talking about on 106, 107. Again, very Aurobidian in the sense, but as he says, that, and I love to wrestle with this because the anthropocentrism in it is also present from a kind of post-human approach or ecological approach. It's like it's a really interesting question to wrestle with. What is our relationship in the rest of the sort of Gaian evolutionary history, right? Are we a center? Are we is it more appropriate to call us a middle? Um, and how do we hold this insight alongside a kind of more post-human turn, or is that even necessary? These are just sort of the questions I swim with. But as he talks about, it could be said that in man and only in man, the actual becomes adequate to the virtual. It could be said that Man is capable of rediscovering all the levels, all the degrees of expansion and contraction. We didn't get to that today, but that coexist in the virtual whole, as if he were capable of all the frenzies and brought about in himself successively everything that elsewhere can only be embodied in different species. Even in his dreams, he rediscovers or prepares matter, and durations that are inferior or superior to him are still internal to him. Man therefore creates a differentiation that is valid for the whole, and he alone traces out an open direction that is able to express a whole that is itself open. Whereas other directions are closed and go round in circles, whereas a distinct plane of nature corresponds to each one, man is capable of scrambling the planes, of going beyond his plane as his own condition, in order finally, and this is the Spinozan term, to express naturing nature. Like, boom, there's the sort of big metaphysical statement, and mystical one about sort of the evolutionary um, process and spiritual processes involved in the human being. And I've often found that there's such resonance with this expression. And Pico, the Renaissance humanist, his description of the human as this self-fashioning being, right? All the other creatures in nature have kind of established places and they do a distinct thing, but the human being is undecided, right? We can fashion ourselves. And of course, there's a kind of an anthropocentric centering in the statement, but there's also this recognition that nature intensifies, right? That nature is in the process of intensifying its creative expressions. So anyway, love all this stuff, and I know I'm dropping it here at a really interesting point, but I feel like it's a good follow up for the next round. So if you like this and you're not already a paid subscriber, if you can, would appreciate that. That keeps the lights on and keeps the publications going. And there's my son coming up. So that's my cue to put on my dad hat today, and we'll follow up again soon with another announcement. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining me. Thanks for participating. Till next time. Bye, everybody.